this is one of the events in our We Are Takoma Arts and Culture series. We've got all kinds of events. A lot of them usually happen on Thursdays or Friday tonight. We've got lectures, film screenings, poetry readings, art exhibition out here. And if you picked up one of our programs, they're in here, or you can go to the city's Facebook page or to takomapmd.gov/arts. And on the back of the program, there's a big American Primitive Guitar Festival coming up. This should interest you all. It's called the 1,000 Incarnations of the Rose, and there's more info here. And I believe Daniel Bachman, our guitarist tonight, will be back for that as well. So I'll hand things over now to David Eisner. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for supporting your local hometown venue here. It's a great auditorium. Someday, maybe with your help, it'll be renamed the John Fahey Auditorium. Has a little better ring to it than the no-name auditorium. So, whoa, man, that's a rogues gallery over there. Holy moly. We have, to my left, your right, Richard Harrington. There you go. Richard's habit is sort of having newspapers go out of business, which he'll explain when he's under oath. And then WPFW Sunday morning. You guys probably are familiar with a show called G-Strings. You've probably always wondered what Tom Cole looks like. There he is. And now here's somebody I just met, and actually Mark, who's sitting all the way at the end, keeps reintroducing us to, this is Ray Parker. And Ray it's DC Public Library, and it's Special Collections. Got it right. So Ray's connection to Mark Minster, the final person up there, they were researching Fahey together. And Mark, as you see, is a wealth of information. So we thought we'd put together something that you'd all appreciate. There's going to be, as you can probably tell, some slides, a little video, some live performance, lots of yak. We will have a time for a Q&A. I'll be the runner in the first half. I will bring the microphone to you. Don't shout out your question. Wait till you're on mic. Why? Because we're recording this. So you want to be recorded for posterity. Okay, Mark, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, David.
All right, take it away, Mark.
David Eisner, Institute of Musical Traditions. Thank you, David, for helping us host this tonight. So the origin of tonight really started when about a decade ago, some of my students at the high school where I am wanted to do a documentary on some musician that was local, and we started on John Fahey. And out of that, we found this interview. Stefan Grossman filmed this in 1997, about 3.5 years before John died. And there's something that's very striking. So we're actually going to start with about a 1.5-minute clip where John characterizes the Washington music scene of 1960-61. And so we're going to just start with that. So I'll have these gentlemen play this, and then from there we will have our discussion. We'll start with that.
When did you leave the Washington, D.C. area?
1962, the music scene there was so bad that several of us decided to come out to Berkeley and take over the music scene, the folk music scene here anyway. And there were about 40 of us actually came out. This was something we planned at parties. Ed Denson was in on it, and a lot of other people. And we came out gradually, but we made quite an impact here, which was impossible in Washington, D.C.
So that's the genesis of this discussion tonight. We want to address Mr. Fahey and his claim that there was really nothing happening and it was a bad scene. So we thought we would start with some musicologists and historians, folks like Richard Harrington and Tom Cole, to talk about this. So I'm gonna start with Richard. And Richard, you were here at the time that John was around on the scene and playing. And how would you characterize the music scene at that time? Because this is a pretty bleak picture that he paints here.
I too almost moved to Berkeley. No, just kidding. certainly wasn't as bad. I have to state at the beginning that in that period that John's talking about, I'm 15, 16, 17 years old, although I look like I was 21. So I was able to go to places like the coffee houses and any place that could be gotten to through public transportation because my family didn't have a car. And there was activity. It was strange. I think you have a montage of various venues that were here. What I can tell you is that there was an openness to folk music here, thanks to people like named Lomax and Seeger, among others. But between those two families, folk music was in the air because they were such a part of it in the deepest parts of the folk music scene. There were also, in the early 60s, there were a number of coffee houses, which you're going to show pictures of and we'll talk about. And starting in 62, 63, the hootenanny craze. Anybody remember hootenannies? The Washington Post once had a headline that said, "Anybody want to have a hootenanny?" And there was another story in 1964 says, "Four argue until they convince judge of innocence in DuPont hootenanny." Now, I didn't actually, I just looked at the headline. I didn't bother to look to see what happened at that DuPont hootenanny, but it must have been something for the Post to be covering it. And if you remember the Hootenanny TV show, that first show was shot here at Arena Stage. And that created a whole different set of vibes. But what Fahey was talking about, since he left here in 62, is a very nascent club scene, coffee house scene, because it just wasn't a popular kind of music. I'll read you some clips in a little while that will be quite hilarious and capturing what happened by 62 and 63. But what he was talking about was true. There was not a whole lot going on, and it wasn't particularly distinguished. So we'll have to give him the credit on that one.
Tom, you've studied music for much of your life, and you've been in this area for a long time. What can you comment on that? I mean, in terms of the music scene in the 60s? I mean, not just folk, but rock in general.
I was 9, so I didn't get out much. What I do know is, you know, as Richard said, the Seegers were here, and Elizabeth Cotton worked for them, and she performed around town. I remember hearing about Mississippi John Hurt playing at Potter's House. So there was something going on. I mean, by the time I started getting into it at 14, 15, the Washington Ethical Society up on 16th Street had concerts. That's about what I know about that period.
And so, to go back to Richard on that, as a young, aspiring folk musician with your guitar, do you feel that the scene in Washington, D.C. in those years of 59, 60, 61, were they accommodating for a fledgling young guitarist who was just trying to make it?
Well, again, that part of my life is very early on, and thank goodness and I did not pursue it. Dick Sari, I used to play at some of the hootenannies, at the Cellar Door, at the Casino Royal, which was a burlesque house downtown that Dick Sari used to do hootenannies from there on Sunday nights, I think it was. I mean, every place tried to have a hootenanny of one kind or another, so I guess there is magic to that word. And I would say that there were not a lot of opportunities. There certainly was not an opportunity to make a living, but folk music, as one of these articles that I will read later will tell you, was made by inspired amateurs who did it because they loved it. And so therefore it didn't make any difference if it was a coffee house, if it was a basement of a church, if it was in your backyard, if it was in your living room. It was a folk approach, which still exists to a certain degree to this day. But in terms of making a career, first of all, you should all be glad that I did not pursue it. I will just say that.
One of the guests we had invited tonight who couldn't be here, Mark Apostolnik, who's Capital Rock and has done some incredible research, has provided us with some information and detail. So what we're going to do up on the screen, if you can cue to the next slide, We're going to talk about some of these places that were in existence long before I was born. This is Hamilton Arms, and I thought we could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, just jumping in here. Can either one of you just tell us about the significance of the building there we see in that slide? It's,
Well, Hamilton Arms is best known to my hippie cultural friends from the 60s because the building itself was cool, but what was better was behind it. They had this sort of gardens. You could walk in there and feel like you were in New Orleans. Everything was painted pink, and there was cats all over the place. I mean, there literally were a dozen cats, feral cats living back there, and people would feed them, and there were all these little apartments. So it felt like it was a world apart. It was a block off of Wisconsin Avenue, and yet you'd step through the gate there, and you'd be in another world. So it was mostly an interesting place, and again, this is a long time ago. It was a great place to get stoned.
Yeah, that's one of the
I'm not
things
recommending it, of course.
that Mark Posnick had talked about was that this was just like Bohemian culture in Georgetown at that time.
Absolutely.
There was a snapshot of Bohemian culture that was rarely found in D.C. other than in this 31st Street address with the apartments in the back.
Because it
Can
felt
you-
like New Orleans, basically. So.
Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so here it is today. That building's still standing on 31st Street. I think there's an architectural group in there.
And then you guys want to go to the next slide then? Or is it this
Yeah.
one? Right. Okay. So Coffee and Confusion.
Yep.
So this is on New Hampshire Avenue. And Tom, you want to tell us, do you know anything about this? Or is this more of a Richard?
It's a Richard thing.
Richard, you want to
They were
fill us
only
in
in
on
that
this?
location for a week before the police closed them down because, it was a bohemian beatnik place, so they were closed down. And then they moved to the next slide is at 9th and K, and the club itself moved to the bottom. You can sort of see where you go down the steps. And that was actually a pretty cool place. They had poetry readings. I actually, a little later on, from the time they opened, went and I would read poems by Philip Levine and Kenneth Patchen and, other people very earnestly. Because, again, I was 16 and I felt very empowered by doing that. It was also the place where I met my first genuine hipster, a guy named Teddy Portachenko, and my first transvestite, Princess. These are people I remember to this day. Perhaps that would be true, and so it was a fascinating place. There were Jim Morrison used to go there and read his poetry. Marko Sosnick has written about that, did a whole book about it, as a matter of fact, about Jim Morrison and growing up in this area. So it ultimately kept changing its name. I think the next thing will show some of the various names that it operated under. But it was great. I mean, again, it was a non-alcoholic club, as I recall. I was only 16, so I wasn't drinking anyways. But it was the kind of place that a 16-year-old who looked 21 could go in and just be a part of the scene and not make any great impression or just kind of fit in and take stuff in. So that was the beginnings of a counterculture for me, and I think for a lot of people.
Can we move to the next slide? I think it's a shot of the interior with the owner.
Yeah, Bill Walker. This is the image of Bill and Ruth Walker.
And then Richard, can you expand a little bit and tell us if you ever saw Fahey playing there? And
No, the only time I ever saw Fahey playing back in those days, I don't know, but I think it may have been like 1961, maybe 62, although he may have left by then. And there was a church in the basement of a church. There was a coffee house in the basement of a church at GW somewhere on the campus there. And what I remember, and I didn't remember this until many years later, was a guy coming in, very clean cut, very collegiate, as most people were back in those days, and playing this sort of expansive acoustic guitar. Could have been Robbie Basho, I've been told, but I think it was Fahey, who wasn't yet the Fahey. He was working his way towards being the Fahey that we know and appreciate and love at this point. But I've tried to think back, and I'm pretty sure it was him. I can't say for sure. I hope it was because, again, it made an impression, but I was too young to understand what was going on musically and culturally there.
And it sounds like you were largely an observer of.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm 16 years old, 15 years old, and you're really in the process of taking stuff in and being impressed by things and being shocked by things and being surprised by things. So I think that was true, and I've always hoped that it was Fahey that I saw.
Yeah, me too. Was there admission charge to get in there, and did you ever play there?
At Coughing
Coughing,
Confusion, I played there once as Coughing Confusion. Later on, I was going to school in New England, to boarding school, so I was only really here during the summer and holidays. And so I was limited in how I did it, but I did a couple of times bravely play guitar besides reading poetry at the Crow's Toe.
And did you get paid?
No, people didn't get paid.
We were going to go back and ask for your payment, is why
Okay.
we asked.
I should pay them.
So, Coffee and Confusion, one of those seems to be kind of legendary places. Another one that a lot of people are probably familiar with is the Unicorn, which I think we have an image. Oh, sorry, that's Java Jungle and 2100. It's in that block somewhere. That's as good as we could get. You'll notice the photo, the horses have been cropped out, but those buildings are long gone. That's in Foggy Bottom. Doesn't look anything like that now. If you go to the next slide, the Unicorn, which there's probably people, we get a show of hands of people here in the audience that were in the Unicorn. Okay, we've got a couple up front, which is important because you're part of that history. And you'll notice there's a Hootenanny advertisement up there. Can both of you talk about the Unicorn? I can start with Richard, Tom, and have you follow up.
I never went.
Okay, so we'll start with Richard to talk a little bit about
Again, it
the
was
Unicorn.
a place where being, a teenager, you could be admitted, and it was definitely a bohemian spot. Elliot lived above there. Elliot Ryan, who bought it and owned it, and who I would later partner with in a paper called Unicorn Times. Elliot had started it in 1973, I think, and I came in 1975 and became the editor and published it through 1980, and then it kept going for another 4 years after that. But Elliot was a hipster. He was the world's worst businessman, but he had good ideas and good intentions. And, so the Unicorn lasted for, I think, 3 years maybe. And it was a cool spot. I mean, it was, it was interesting. People went there, and as a teenager, that's what I was interested, was interesting people who did interesting things. Later on, he took that same aesthetic to starting the Unicorn Times, and Unicorn became actually a pretty big paper and an influential paper in Washington, supporting local music, local artists, local poets, various other things. So Elliot has an important place in all of this.
And you'll see him there in the image. It's a really grainy black and white. But to the left where it says the Hootenanny, Wednesday nights, I believe. So at a Hootenanny, I'm assuming it would be all local musicians from D.C. area, from Maryland,
People
from Virginia.
passing through.
Even people passing through.
Oh, yeah.
Can you think of do you remember some of the people who played there?
I've seen lists of different names. Again, I don't quite remember most of the people. There's nobody who jumps out at me and I don't think I saw Fahey there. I think I only saw him that one time, before he became John Fahey. But, if you read some of the histories, like Mark Sosnick has written a fantastic story, which you should look up, it's on the internet, which is a history of D.C. folk clubs and beat places. And he gives a list of some of the people who play there, and it's pretty impressive. So, yeah, I mean, I think it was the kind of place where it was a receptive home to certain creative types who didn't have any other place to play.
So we can go to the next slide. Ontario Place, another important venue, and I know, Tom, you're familiar with some of the music that came out of there, some of the blues musicians like Mississippi John Hurt that would come back and play, and I know there's other people in the audience who've been to Ontario Place as well. This is the only image we could find, and you'll see in the back, it looks as if it's just painted there on a board or on a sheet with Mississippi John Hurt. That's a photo that comes from the Tom Hoskins collection. Significance of Ontario Place, gentlemen. What was that place about?
Do you
You.
There was an important thing that occurred that Fahey was definitely a part of. And is that Gene that I see back there? Yes. Gene Rosenthal of Adelphi Records is here. is also an incredibly important person in all of this because their fandom and their desire to find, honor, and expose the great classical blues artists, particularly of the 20s and 30s, who had recorded and whose work had been dismissed and was essentially completely forgotten. People like Gene, people like Fahey, people like Tom Hoskins, people especially like Dick Spotswood, and a bunch of others based in this area. They went and they canvassed looking for old records, but then they went further and they started searching for these particular artists. And they found people like Mississippi John Hurt. They found people like Skip James, Booker White. Other people who they brought back into the spotlight, sometimes only briefly because they were on their last legs, but they brought them back into a mainstream of appreciation. And if they hadn't done that, the whole blues revival would definitely not have happened. So they all deserve intense credit for that, for bringing attention to it. And I think that was an essential part of Fahey's legacy. But, you know, Gene deserves a very big hand in all of this because what he did and then recordings that he made for Adelphi of some of these people are really important in terms of the musical history and cultural history. So. And before I forget, as I understand it, Gene, you were the one who was responsible essentially for figuring out how to capture Fahey in the recording session by miking him very closely, which was something that was generally not done, and that allowed his particular kind of power and genius to come through in a way that some of the earlier recordings that he made with Buzzard weren't quite the same. So again, credit for helping make the Fahey sound accessible and recognizable. So.
One thing you have to remember too is that this was during the civil rights era. Young white people were going to the South, trying to organize, trying to, get people out to vote, and it was a very dangerous time for, young white guys to be going down to the South. Dick Spotswood told me a story one time about, facing a gun, somebody wondering what he was doing down there, and they deserve a lot of credit for basically risking their lives to try to find these guys and bring them back.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to the next slide. It's a shot of DC in 1962.
That's actually Potter's house, but
We'll move.
Go ahead.
You guys,
just keep it back. That's fine.
you want to keep it here?
Yeah.
So as we all know, in 1962, Fahey left for the West Coast, ended up in Berkeley to, in quotes, take over the folk scene there. Tom, can you talk about why the West Coast, why Berkeley, and whether New York City was still sort of the central of that kind of folk music at the time?
I think you had scenes. It's interesting that it didn't happen here in Washington because we've got plenty of universities, but you think of New York and Greenwich Village, you think of Boston certainly had a huge folk music scene, Chicago, and God, what was the name of it? I wrote it down. But at any rate, and then San Francisco too had a very big folk scene. Jesse Fuller was one of the players who was popular at the time. A lot of people came out of that scene. Barbara Dane, who's still alive. So I'm guessing maybe it had something to do with the universities, the particular kinds of universities. Again, I don't know why it didn't happen here.
The image up there, we said of DC, this is a 1962 picture, but this is Potter's house, and some of you know that is still in existence, apparently. So that's 62, and here we are in 2018. Any memories about Potter's house in particular, Richard?
No.
Okay.
It's kind of the equivalent, the venue equivalent of those of us who are on stage. We're still here. It's still here.
Yeah. So I guess this is for either of you. So speaking of, there was folk was an important thing, but there was so many other types of music coming out of here. And so if you talked about Washington, D.C., early 60s, mid 60s, what was D.C. known for musically? Tom or Richard and both, and or both?
Well, country, especially country and sort of primitive rock and roll, the downtown area, New York Avenue, and that 14th Street were peppered with clubs that offered this kind of music. R&B was popular, but not downtown so much, although people like Chubby Checker would play there, you know. In terms of Georgetown was mostly cover bands appealing to students until the arrival of the Shadows in the early 60s. The Shadows predated the Cellar Door, and some of the people who played there included the Big Three, which was Cass Elliot and Denny Doherty, and I think Zali Yanofsky was part of the Big Three. And then they sort of transformed into the Mugwumps, who were sort of one of the first folk rock bands. And then, of course, most of them went on to form the Mamas and Papas, who had their own particular history. But the Shadows was a club where people like Carol Hadine and Donald Lease, who still actually plays around town every once in a while, performed on a regular basis. In 1965, the Shadows moved from where it had been at 34th and M Street down to the corner of Wisconsin and M, where there would later be a Hamburger Hamlet for those of you who ever passed through there over the years. But they died there for some other reason, but the venue reopened as Cellar Door, and Cellar Door became one of the most honored and vaunted venues in the country. It was known as a listening club. People went there and were given a heads up that they were there to see the performance and please no talking. They didn't have to hear about cell phones because they were years away from being invented. So it was important, and you know, everybody who was anybody played there. It was a small club. It was 140 seats, and later they expanded with balconies to 230. But because of its reputation, everybody played there. They'd play there for 4 or 5 days. Fahey played there a couple of times on extended runs, once with Peter Lang, and I think once with, I forget who the opening act was. But it was the kind of place where you could play for 3 or 4 days, or sometimes 5 or 6 days, and you could kind of settle in and get these intimate shows. So it was an incredibly important venue to Washington.
And Cellar Door is one of my favorites. And my question is off script here. This notion of sort of this regional knowledge of these places. So people who grew up here and lived here, like yourself, who would go to these clubs and become aware of it. And that's why we're talking about them now here. But the Cellar Door, at least in my mind, it had sort of a national reputation. Is that true? And if so, could we talk about that a little bit more? How that resonated beyond the borders of DC?
It was one of the most famous clubs in the country. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I said people would take less money to play there because it was such a prestigious venue. And it had fantastic acoustics, it had fantastic lighting, it had a fantastic staff. It really was a place. For about 2 years, I lived right across the street from there above what later became Desperados. And I used to sing at some of the hootenannies there. That was my last dying professional career anywhere near an actual microphone, until now again. Anyways, and I used to, but because I knew everybody there, I used to sit on the steps that led from the back patio, which led up to the dressing rooms, and then down to the stage. And I saw so many amazing shows there, again, just from being friends with people. So I have particularly strong memories of the venue and the acts that I saw there, and it's probably one of the top 3 or 4 clubs historically in the country.
Yeah, Tom, you want to add to that? I know there's been a lot of, not being there seeing it, but like recordings that have come out of there and people who played there. I'm sure.
Oh, sure.
I mean, significance.
I saw a friend of mine and I went to see Les McCann and Eddie Harris there right after they did Compared to What. Danny Gatton recorded there. That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, tons of people made live records there, you know. Neil Young, Oscar Brown Jr., one of the greatest performers of all time. He did a live record, Mr. Brown Goes to Washington. You know.
I just wanted to make a plug here. I'm sorry. we're doing a panel next month at Georgetown Public Library about Cellar Door, about Georgetown music venues, the Bayou. Some guys that made the documentary will be there, and we're gonna have a remembering Jack Boyle moment and that kind of thing. So keep an eye out for that. It's the second Wednesday in April. I'm sorry I don't have the date, but anyway, I want to plug that.
All right, so we're going to open it up. So I'm sure there's people who have some questions or comments. We have people who've been to some of these places. So Mr. Eisner's got the microphone. He's going to take one of these and come around.
Okay, questions? Coming to you so you can get on the recording. I know you got excited. I'll be back for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have great memories of the Cellar Door. I mean, as you said, it was the perfect size. The sound was great. One of the memorable acts I saw there before he became a corporation was Jimmy Buffett, before he did Margaritaville. And his first 3 albums, which I'm sure you know, especially A1A, is great. I pretty much quit listening to him after that because a lot of the stuff was all the same. But he was there with a great songwriter named Dick Feller. If you remember him, he did Any Old Wind That Blows and a few other songs. And it was just, I mean, I was no further from them than I am from the stage here. And just, you know, I mean, God, I wish it was back.
Thank you for that.
That's something, you know, the number of opening acts who went on to significant careers, if you were to go back and look at their ads and schedules, it's amazing. Everybody started out there at one way or another.
All right, well, turn it over to the illustrious Steve Huffman. Give him your best DJ voice.
I just have a minor question, but that first venue you showed was called, what, Hamilton Arms? Or? Hamilton Arms. Yeah, I mean, how did they make a living? What was the basis of the business? Did they sell food, drinks, or?
So Mark Aposnick, we'd hoped to have been here, would have been able to answer that for you, but from what I've read from his research, I mean, it basically started as it was rental properties, right? And so kind of like Paris, as you said, and at some point the owner said to his wife, why don't we have a little coffee shop? So there was a coffee shop there in the front, but at the same time you had people who were just living there, so it was kind of like having a coffee shop in a commune in a sense. I mean, there's just people just coming in and out. Again, I wasn't there, but Mark's research.
They just had all these tiny little apartments. It really was like New Orleans or Paris. I mean, and everything was painted pink or some gaudy color. It was a Technicolor experience.
Any other questions? Yes, here we go.
I saw John Fahey at the Cellar Door, and one of the things that I remember is that he didn't say a word. He came out, he played, and he left. And I don't know if that was a typical performance for him or not. But I mean, the playing was great, but I never heard his voice.
Gene, can you say anything about your project? Are you allowed to say anything about it? I mean, not allowed, but are you willing to say anything
Gene
about
Rosenthal.
That's pretty much correct. John didn't spend or waste a lot of time with words, and if he did, it was usually because he was inebriated and wanted to insult the audience. But in general, he would just get up there and play and get off the stage and come back after the break and do the same thing. He played the Cellar Door twice, to the best of my knowledge, separated maybe by a year. And he played 2 days in a row when we filmed him back in '69. I don't know whether the person who was just talking saw him at that, but he opened for Richie Havens on one of those days, who was a regular at the Cellar Door. But in general, he didn't have too much to say.
But Gene, can you say anything about the project? Because I think that's going to be really interesting.
It's moving along a lot faster now than it has in the previous 40, 50 years. We're actually hoping to have something semi-presentable by the summer.
Right.
And,
but what Gene's, can I say what you're...
Sure, go ahead.
He filmed Fahey, and as far as I know, it's one of the few full performances by Fahey that was recorded. Is that correct to say that?
Yeah, we filmed 3 sets, 2 different days, and then we went on the road with him. and documented him doing a canvassing expedition in Middle Virginia, so which gives a whole different side of what Fahey was about and what his roots were about. But you'll get to see it, I promise, pretty soon.
All right, we have that down on tape, so to speak.
On tape, yeah. Other questions?
Anyone?
Over here in the back, Mr. Eisner.
Put a hand up.
In the back.
In the back. Okay, here we go.
Thank you, David.
This is Mary Cliff.
Who used to also play the Hootenannies.
Yes. Thank you. I first ran into our reviewer here as David, and he was always singing Bob Dylan's
Girl from the North Country.
The Dream.
Oh,
that was
too,
your
yeah.
big hit.
I wasn't very good, was I?
You
Please
were
tell the
fine.
truth.
This was the Sunday night
Fine.
Hootenannies.
That's a
It
nice
was
word.
run by Dick Sari, and you had to audition for him. And Chip and I used to close the Sunday nights frequently. He was a professional musician, my future ex-husband, and and he became the house musician there. So it became the cellar door in the early 60s, the very early 60s. The Shadows was much later.
No, Shadows was first, and then Cellar Door is 65, and
Yeah,
Shadows
but Shadows didn't become something until later.
Yeah.
And Tom Lyons owned the cellar door, and I recall at one point being offered significant interest in the cellar door if I had a mere $25,000, which at the time was on the moon, you know. The waiters, I mean, I worked upstairs. I took reservations and typed up contracts. And on the shelf, the other side of the desk, there were always a couple of black and white record jackets. John Fahey. And they were there. And of course, Donna Lease lived next door.
Okay.
And it was quite an amazing place. The waiters built the balconies. They did not ask the fire marshal. And I would take 220 reservations for a given night. They figured 20% wouldn't show. And one of the reasons that it's abandoned now is that the fire marshal came in after the last sale and looked around and said 124, and that was the end of the nightclub. But everybody played there. Ian and Sylvia, Joe and Eddie, Bud and Travis, those were folks that my husband played bass with. Our favorite was Josh White, whom we adored, and from 65 to 69, Chip played bass with him. But because Chip was a union musician, we could only play places where nobody got paid. If somebody got paid $10, $20, we couldn't go because those were the union rules. And my father, ex-law, was the vice president of the local. So it was kind of obvious if we showed up.
This is from a 1962 Star story. Most of Washington folk music is heard outside the clubs. It is the music made by amateurs who sing folk songs purely for the joy of it. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, the cellar door is the reason I got into radio, because Dick Sari knew then I was a typist. He needed a typist. I went to work with him as a typist, and then as everybody was electrifying, he didn't like that. So I said, well, I'll program that stuff for you, and you continue to play it. And he said, a better idea, you program it, and you host it. And I went, what? And that was 50 years ago. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Woo.
So we're gonna move to the next segment of the program, which is we're gonna take a 3 or 4 minute break, and then we're gonna have a wonderful performance by Mr. Daniel Bachman, who's here tonight, coming up from Fredericksburg, Virginia. So you got a minute to use the restroom? Stretch, and we'll be back shortly.
Thank you. Gotta change picks. That one just almost broke on me. Hey, I'd like to thank David and Mark for inviting me up, having me be a part of this evening. That last song's called The Flower Tree. This one's called Wine and Peanuts. If I can get it in tune, give me a second. Start that over, and I'm gonna retune real quick. I got new strings on. Wait a second. There it is. Thank you. All right. This tune is called Beautiful Eyes of Virginia. It's by Lemuel Turner. He was a guitar player from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. It's a waltz.
Thank you.
All right, let me try this one. This thing keeps kind of falling down on me too. So this next song is called, well, it's either called Weary Lonesome Blues or Lonesome Weary Blues, but I can't remember right now. It's by Roy Harvey and Leonard Copeland. It's a duet, but I play it as a solo. Thank you. So I'm going to play a couple more for you. I'm going to play one more. My sister's going to join me. I thought about playing other Fahey tunes tonight, and I kind of was like, maybe I'll do one, maybe I won't do any. And I'm going to do one because I kind of still have this one typed. Get this thing. Sarah, you want to join me for the last one? It's my sister Sarah. We're going to play what's that? That was called Steamboat Going Around the Bend. And so we're going to play one last tune. This is kind of a slower, longer, meditative tune. And then we're going to have another panel discussion and Q&A, I think. So, hey, thank you guys for listening to me. I'm hanging out. Come talk to us. We're hanging. So, hit it, Sarah. All right, thanks, guys. We're moving into phase 3.
his own take on all this music and his own music, and Tom Cole. We also have with us David Eisner from House of Musical Traditions and IMT, who's putting this on, and of course Richard Harrington. So we're going to start, as we did the first panel, with just a really short clip where John's talking specifically about how he got started playing music when he was living in Takoma Park, and also how he tried to do something that in his mind or his opinion, and sometimes John had a pretty big ego about some things. I didn't know him personally, so I can't say that with all authority, but he talks about how he was doing something that nobody else was doing. So if you'll roll that clip for us, please. This is about a 2-minute clip.
John, when did you first pick up the guitar?
Oh, I was about 13, and yeah. I saw some other guys older than me. They were meeting girls in the park in the summer by taking guitars around and playing them and singing country western. It was just country western. So I bought a $17 Sears and Roebuck Silvertone. The action was about that high. And I got to know these guys, and they helped me out, a few chords, stuff. But I didn't meet any girls that way till about 10 years later. On the other hand, I did learn to play the guitar.
What type of music were you listening to?
Well, let's see, at that time, I was listening at first just to country western, and then the radio station we listened to hear country western, this was in Washington, D.C., changed its format and started playing nothing but bluegrass. So then I got very interested in bluegrass. Early bluegrass is my favorite kind of music. Not too many people know that. But I couldn't learn to play it because you had to play so fast, you know. So I learned a few country western songs. I bought a chord book, and right away I started writing my own stuff, you know, which nobody else did that. I don't know why, but I mean, I had a big background in listening to classical music, and I started trying to compose like I was playing a guitar, but I heard an orchestra in my head, you know. So I was really composing for full orchestra. And of course I didn't know enough chords or harmony yet, but I came up with some interesting stuff.
So with that in mind, we're going to start with Tom Cole. And Tom, John claims no one else was really doing this. In terms of, is that a fair and accurate statement in 1959 in terms of recording instrumental, original, or appropriated, but original guitar instrumental music? Is that fair and accurate?
Well, yes and no, I think. I mean, you know, the people that he came to learn about, you know, after, as he said, he started out listening to country and western and bluegrass, and then got turned on. I think it was Dick Spotswood turned him on to Blind Willie Johnson, and he got into blues. But there were people like Reverend Gary Davis and Booker White who were doing sort of extended improvisations, long tunes. Booker White, sometimes he called them sky songs. They were 20 minutes, half an hour long. Sometimes he would just keep playing and playing and playing. So there was that precedent. As far as recording it, strictly instrumental stuff, maybe he was. I mean, and he certainly brought in, as he mentioned, you know, classical music. One of my favorite records of his is The Yellow Princess, and the title tune comes from a Camille Saint-Saëns piece. So he was bringing a lot of different influences to it that maybe some other people weren't. So that's the yes and no answer.
Richard, what's your take on that in terms of the originality and what he was doing?
Well, I think, by the way, I want to ask this. How many people were transported by Daniel's last piece in particular? Okay. So that particular place is something I think that Fahey does in pretty much all his music. He transports you, and his vocabulary is just much larger than most other people's, and was right from the beginning, although it didn't manifest itself until later in his recordings. But yes, he sort of fiddled around with country, then he was taken with bluegrass, titled his book, How Bluegrass Music Destroyed My Life, although he doesn't actually tell you how until the actual final chapter. But it's a book worth reading. It is, because he's a great writer. And then he delves into the blues, and he was already into the classical, and then he got into various world musics as well, and other styles. And so what he did that's different than somebody like Gary Davis is he took in so many different influences. He absorbed them, he became enthralled with them, you could say, regurgitated them with his own original vision, and there is no one who was doing that. People could make an argument for Robbie Basho or some of the other people, but I think Fahey, especially when he hits his stride in the mid-'60s, is totally original, totally influential. I think what Daniel performed tonight could not have even been imagined in 1960. By 1965, yes, because he's getting some currency, but he is totally original and stands apart just because of the breadth of what he incorporates into his music.
Thank you for that. This is next questions for Tom and Richard and Daniel, if you want to offer your thoughts on this. It may be known that John wasn't fond of the term American primitive guitar, but the term has stuck and stayed around. How would you define his style of music?
Well, I mean, it's pretty much unique. I don't feel the need to label it, and I sort of, I kind of understand why he wouldn't have wanted to label it either. It is what it is. You can call it that. I mean, and I think he even called his music American primitive early on, and then maybe came to reject the term. But it's pretty sophisticated, so I don't know that primitive really applies.
He once walked it back a little bit and said that when he used that term, he didn't mean it the way people were interpreting it. He meant primitive in the sense of being self-taught. And, that puts a whole different light on it. And when you realize the incredible sophistication, harmonically, melodically, every other way that goes into his music, attaching the word primitive totally undermines it. So I think he grew to reject that label and resent the fact that he had put it on himself.
And so, going back to what you were saying, Tom, I mean, if it was the original thing, instrumental music, we have like Elizabeth Cotton, she sings on some songs. We've got Sylvester Weaver, older songs, singing. But again, I don't have the history that you guys do. Like, when you think about instrumental music, because personally I was interested in how Wyndham Hill sprung out of what Takoma was about. And we can talk about Takoma in a little bit because it's an instrumental label for the most part. I mean, you would be able to comment on that. But, instrumental records, solo instrumental records, even in any genre, was that stuff coming out in the 40s and the 50s?
It was coming out in the 20s.
In the 20s.
Yeah, I mean, you had people like Eddie Lang and Lonnie Johnson made some incredible duets, and Eddie Lang made solo recordings as well, a lot of jazz recordings. Scrapper Blackwell, I mean, yeah, there were some really, really, really good guitar players recording in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
And so one of the clips in this, and we're not going to watch the next clip, but he talks about how he learned from these records. And one of the things I think that John was fascinated by, and again, didn't know the guy, Gene, you can comment on this, was the mythology that surrounded some of these folks, like Blind Blake, don't know a lot about him. Charlie Patton, this kind of mysterious figure. And so one of the questions I have for the group here is, can you talk about how John's influences, again, because he didn't live in the internet age, so he couldn't find out where Blind Blake's influences were, or any of that stuff, how much John kind of strived to create this mythology, which had that kind of mythical, shadowy experience that a lot of these musicians he learned from on old records?
Well, one of the things that's great about John, and I'm saying this as an observer, obviously, is he was incredibly smart and he studied philosophy. I mean, that, you know, and was taken up with that in ways that graduates and undergraduates aren't always. But he was also interested in the lively ancient cultures of country music, bluegrass, blues, and other things. And part of that was obviously the mythology, because so little was known about those people, and he embraced that for himself. You know, the whole thing with Blind Joe Death, I'm trying to find this one quote in, I think maybe it was on Death Chance, and he was talking, giving a little mythology to Blind Joe Death. He gave him a part-time job embalming the downtrodden people of Takoma Park who had gone before. So, you know, he played with this, and he parodied a lot of the folklorists and archaeologists of, you know, that he dealt with culturally. But there was a love and an appreciation and an understanding and deep research into all of this. So I think the mythology that he created around himself sometimes was not to his advantage, because people enjoyed reading the myth and believing the myth, as opposed to the complexities that really were part of his life. But it definitely was part of that. Daniel, when you first started hearing Fahey, had that mythology disappeared? Was there already a better sense of who he was and what he had actually done?
I wasn't really aware of any of that. I just kind of heard it from an emotional place. I just heard it from as deeply complex emotional music, and that's what got me first. But then I did get hooked with some of the mythology, and I have met a number of people over the years that worked with him, and A&R guys, and I've heard some crazy stories, and a lot of them are true, and a lot of them aren't, though, too. So, yeah.
What I'd like to add to that is that obviously we're here to celebrate this amazing genius, but he was also kind of a social misfit. He was very difficult to work with. He went through managers like he went through alcohol, and you know, because of this explosive genius, that's why we have the music. But I think that when that primitive American primitive guitar tag got on him, he did reject it. He didn't really like the attention. What he wanted to be doing is sitting and playing, and didn't want to have to deal with a lot of the real world around it. One time that I produced him in concert, I don't know if any of you were around, it was in the early 80s, maybe 80, 81, 82, at Takoma Park Presbyterian Church, corner of Maple and Tulip. Greg Eisner and Terry Leonino were working at the shop. Somehow they hooked me up with the fact that he was touring, and I got a letter from his manager, and it said, "Please note, do not give John alcohol before, during, or after the performance. Thank you." I thought, well, that's reasonable, until he came in with his bottle of Jack Daniels half gone already. The bottle and John half gone. And he, as someone mentioned earlier, he played the concert, didn't say anything really to the audience. He got up there, he was mesmerizing, he played really well, and basically in between songs he'd take a hit off the bottle. The bottle was empty by the end of the concert. Kind of got up, nodded at everybody, and walked on out into the night. That was it. So the genius side of him is obviously there, but boy, he struggled through life just in the daily stuff, you know, like probably, I don't know, he ran out of toothpaste. Who needs toothpaste, you know? I mean, it would be that kind of, you know, socially he was difficult, and he had his demons, we knew that. And again, I'm celebrating him, but I think part of the reason, as more and more musicians like Daniel came along and said, this guy's amazing, they upped the ante, and now he was getting attention, which he kind of pulled back from. You know, he certainly, his last couple years were pretty miserable for him, but again, I think he was best if he could have been on his own little mountaintop somewhere and just sent in the recordings. But we demanded an audience, and you know, so that was the side of it. Was you know, we're used to this. We're used to, you know, the geniuses having kind of weird, you know, weird sides to them, kind of.
I was just going to add, maybe the mythology is a way to distract or deflect the attention.
Yeah, yeah.
So this next question deals actually with his influence and his abilities just as a player and a composer. So you know, his dexterity and lyricism on the guitar is known, and he's influenced several generations since his time, as Daniel is an evidence of in front of us. But can the panel here share the names of individuals that you could call out that he influenced in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and beyond? Anyone come to mind?
It seems like anybody that plays guitar seriously, it would be easier to list the ones that weren't influenced by him. It's, you know, M. Ward. We were trying to get M. Ward for a film clip, you know, and he's like, "No, I don't want to be on the film. I'm thinking, oh, great. Not only is he influenced by Fahey, he's starting to act like Fahey. So, but I mean, the guy's great, and you know, but of course he was influenced by him. It's, you know, the same guitarist will list Django Reinhardt. You know, you got to. I mean, it'd be weird for you not to listen to Fahey if you took yourself seriously as a guitar player.
I want to add to that. There's a myriad number of people that he influenced, but there's also probably as large a list of people who hoped to be influenced by him, tried to follow in his path, and realized this is a lot harder than it sounds, and never really pursued it, because really what he's doing is complex. It really demands an emotional commitment as well as a musical commitment. And many people are not ready to make that leap. So I think the list of people who hoped to be influenced by him but just couldn't play the game, that's probably even larger.
Yeah.
I just had a quick follow-up. How would you characterize that influence? Is it just a severe independence, a sound? Well, how would you define that influence in particular?
Dave Van Ronk once described Fahey's playing. He said, and this is mostly on those tunes that are like the blues tunes that he does, where he's tacked the word blues on them. A quick aside, some of you probably own the recordings. John, he didn't want to name these tunes. He didn't care about the names, so he picks names like, and these are local spots, Fear and Loathing at 4th and Butternut. It Came Down Prince George's Avenue. I mean, he obviously didn't care what he called these things. It's back to Dave Van Ronk.
Actually, those are pretty good titles.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, it's scary over there. No, Dave Van Ronk said that when Fahey gets up ahead of steam, look out, because there's like nobody. And if you listen to those blues things and the way Daniel was playing, where you can just feel him digging into the tune and the thing's accelerating and the guitar's about to explode and it just somehow stays glued together. That's the influence. That's what people were hearing.
I think there's a momentum issue here.
Yeah.
And I think throughout his life, he was influenced by things like rivers, trains, the traffic on University in Langley at the Martin's Esso, which was constant, and being the night manager, it was something that he heard probably more clearly than he would hear during the day.
Did Fahey ever pump gas for you?
No. Not,
Okay.
I didn't have a car in those days, so, you know. But, you know, there is a sense of momentum. There's a sense of the shifting tides of a river swelling, or, you know, clouds gathering. I mean, that's a constant, and you hear it in the sort of the emotional and musical nuances as things build, recede, variate. It's really a remarkable thing, and Daniel was, I think, in his playing, made that very clear of how things build their own momentum, and when they're finished, they let you know that they're finished. They let you know that you're finished in a way. So I think that's a constant part of John's sound.
So separate from that influence in terms of the musical sound, Takoma Records, extremely important record label. I mean, if you think about it, it started at St. Michael's All Angels Church up on New Hampshire. He got some money from a priest and a friend, and he put out 100 records. The Blind Joe Death, John Fahey split, and he said, "I'm going to call it Takoma Records." At that point, he probably had no idea that years later there would be 120 some releases on that label. Tom, can you talk a little bit about his importance and influence in terms of an independent, self-produced, self-released artist like John Fahey on Takoma Records?
Well, I mean, he did put the. I mean, he always had people behind him too. I mean, Joe Bassard, put out his first records on Phonotone, and then he partnered with Ed Denson to get Takoma up and running. So, but yeah, it was always an independent record label. It was never something that really made as much money as they wanted it to. I mean, that's one reason I think that he went and recorded those 2 albums for Vanguard. But the label itself, I mean, Leo Kottke's first album came out on that got played all over college radio, when it came out. What else? I mean, there were guitar compilations that he did with Peter Lang, the Peter Lang record, The Thing Outside the Bedroom Window. I mean, it's just, I think they always wanted to make money on it, but they never did, and yet they kept doing it. So it's kind of, that's kind of the way an independent record label works.
Well, the funny thing, the funny thing is that very first record probably would have been the one and only Takoma record. He put it out by himself, and it really was one of the first, self-produced independent records. But I don't think John had a particular vision of doing a record company, and the label doesn't really appear until 1964, when he teams up with Ed Denson, another local pal of his. But what is important is he does sign a lot of similar sounding people, although the thing with Leo Kottke is he said, when I heard the tape, everybody said, "Hey, he sounds just like you." And Fahey says, "Well, actually, he doesn't. He's much faster. There's less emotion, and he said, but I'm going to make a lot of money with this." So, and in fact, I suspect that for many years it was Takoma's bestseller. But the label had other importance besides being one of the very first independent labels, certainly in this particular field. George Winston makes his first record for Takoma in 1973, I think it is, and then eventually he becomes one of the anchors at Windham Hill. But Will Ackerman is so influenced by Takoma recordings by Fahey and others that in 1980, again, all these years blend, he starts Windham Hill, specifically signing George Winston because he's he's the John Fahey of piano. And then, Gene, I think it's 1980 that you and Takoma and several other labels found the National Association for Independent Record Distributors, NAIRD, which becomes an incredibly important force in the record industry, bringing it equity and presence. So, Takoma is a significant historical label, absolutely.
So in today's music world, there's a lot of independent artists. It's nothing new. It's fairly common that artists self-recording, self-producing, through the internet or other means, releasing this stuff. But back in 1959, can we comment on how unique that was?
Well, go back to 1959, you didn't know anybody that had a record out unless they were famous. Nobody said, "Yeah, this is my latest record," and it just didn't happen. And Fahey, he wanted to be on some other labels, but they didn't like his music. It's, no way. It's not going to sell. It's not going to work. Kind of, he was right if you think about musically what was going on in '59. But the difference today, obviously, is everybody, every artist. I mean, they can be doing their first tour and they've already got, they're on Spotify, they're played on Pandora. You don't even have to hand a disc out. They'll give you the download. They'll put it on the back of the business card. So, Fahey, I agree with Richard. I don't think Fahey saw himself as, Atlantic Records coming up, but he, I didn't know anybody that had a record out that I could, except somebody that I would, hear on the radio. So it's pretty spectacular.
Well, technically, Takoma was started to put out a record by Bukka White, and who hadn't recorded for like 25 years, and they, like so many other artists, they found him and they recorded him, and then Fahey had another an album's worth of his own material. But when they started Takoma with those 2 records, the aim was to have Bukka White's records sell, not John's. And, John didn't even have his first paying gig until a year after that in 1965, so.
So we're going to turn things over to question and answer in just a second. I just want to leave with some parting words from our panel here in terms of, we've talked about legacy in terms of his abilities to play the guitar, his emotion, in terms of his record label and all those things. Why is Takoma Park so, let's put it this way, why should Takoma Park forever be connected to John Fahey? I'm gonna go with the unofficial mayor of Takoma Park first,
wait a
David.
minute now, wait. Well, obviously, because he grew up here, and there's some, somewhat amazing stories of him, getting kicked out of choir because he came to choir practice drunk. I mean, it's that'll get you kicked out. And oh gosh, no, I mean I guess you could say he's our most celebrated former resident. And it does appear again in his song titles. He never spoke harshly of Takoma Park. I thought it was neat that when he moved to the West Coast, he kept the spelling Takoma. He didn't switch it to the West Coast, Takoma. And I'm sure somebody probably suggested that he switch it, and I can imagine what the answer was from him. So, yeah, no, it's luckily, I mean, how many towns could we do this? I mean, if we tried to run this thing in Arlington, Virginia, think anybody'd show up? No way. I mean, you guys have a little bit of Fahey in you if you're in that 20912 zip code. So, no, it seemed like the perfect place for, whatever genetic firings and misfirings kind of swirled out of here. Maybe he was drinking the Sligo Creek water. I don't know. But anyway, seriously, I mean, it's the right match for him. It's the right place.
So I'd say it's important and natural for us to associate with him with Takoma Park, because this is where he's formed. This is where he's exposed. This is where he makes his friends who are eager to go on this journey with him, who lead him down certain roads. This is where he is listening to the radio and hears Bill Monroe doing Blue Yodel No. 7. This is where he teams up with so many people, where he's influenced by so many things. So Fahey is totally formed by his experiences here. When he goes out to California in '62, he changes, but he's totally performed. Remember, these are some of the song titles. He also named many songs after his girlfriends, almost all failed relationships. Dreaming Under the B&O Trestle, the Langley Two-Step, Blind Blues, which is also known as Martin's S.O. Blues, Revelations on the Banks of the Pawtuxet, Libba's Rag, which is a tribute to Libba Cotton, and she's the one who schooled him on open tunings in a way and helped him clarify that. View East from the Top of the Riggs Road B&O Trestle, The Downfall of the Adelphi Rolling Grist Mill, which I believe is also where the Adelphi was named after, Gene? Okay. Sligo River Blues, which he elevated from a creek to a river on the Blind Joe Death record, but is still one of his great pieces. You go back and you listen to that, and it's absolutely modern. Feels like it was recorded yesterday, and it's the clarity of it. So Takoma Park informs his life and therefore informs his work, so it's crucial.
I can't add to that.
Yeah, I think so. We're gonna take it over here to the audience now. I think some people want to comment, and I'll do the honors. If questions for our panel, comments, Gene. Comment. Favorite John Fahey memory? You got one? You do.
I don't think I can add to this. They've got it pretty much under control.
Okay. Well, if you guys want to talk to Gene after, he'll be here. Question on the far side. Over here. Over here? Yep.
Another DC boy, Jorma Kaukonen, a few years younger. Did they have any association, or are you aware? I mean, Jorma Kaukonen recorded a lot of stuff by Reverend Gary Davis and other things that he wrote in that style.
I'll bet you they ran into each other on the West Coast. So.
Probably, but not here. Yeah.
There you go.
Since no one else is asking questions, so I did read the How Bluegrass Destroyed My Life. How much of that is actually based in reality?
That's you, Richard.
I mean, I'm really curious. And I moved here, maybe 7 years ago, but I was always a Fahey fan before I moved here. So it's kind of interesting folklore. And I read the book. I was wondering if you guys have any insight.
From my careful reading, I'd say 32% is.
Of which is.
I'm not sure whether 32% is, I don't know.
Reality or unreality.
But it doesn't make any difference because it's all true. I mean, everything that he wrote is what he felt, what he remembered, what he wanted, what he expected, what he experienced. And if you're experiencing things through John Fahey's eyes, they're not going to look like they would look to other people. So I think everything that he wrote is absolutely real, imagined. I mean, to my mind, when I read it, I laughed out loud so many times. He really is. I mean, somebody should do a book, if they haven't already, I don't think they have, of all the liner notes for his records, particularly the first 10 or 15 years, because those liner notes are both hilarious, informative, revealing, and they're beautifully written. The guy could write. It's amazing that he never wrote lyrics, because the writing that he does in his liner notes is exquisite. I put it on a par with Dylan's Chronicles in terms of the raconteurship that's involved as he tells his stories. He was a splendid storyteller. He was a terrible person to listen to talking, but when he was writing, whatever time it took was apparently the right time, because his stories are beautifully written, and I say this as a writer admiring another writer.
Yeah, and pick it up. If you don't have How Bluegrass Destroyed My Soul, you can read all about how when he was in 5th and 6th grade, he and his friends would throw turtles at cars on Ethan Allen Avenue. This is down past the co-op. But you can also read about how he and his girlfriend, Pat Sullivan, used to go under the Carroll Avenue Bridge at night at 2 and 3 in the morning and play guitar. And I can promise you, Sligo Creek looked nothing like it does now. There's no path, right? Gene, you can attest to that. It's probably pretty dirty and dank and dark.
No.
Question, yeah.
It sounds like alcohol was Fahey's drug of choice. Do you know, like, especially after he went to California, did he get involved with any, mind expanding drugs, or if he did that influence his music in any way?
In interviews, he said he never did any drugs other than alcohol.
Gene, did he drink
Gene,
when he was here?
He didn't do any psychedelic drugs, but he did downers like Seconals or barbituls, Valium, stuff like that. As far as I know, he never smoked pot or did LSD or anything like that. But he made up for it in his alcohol consumption.
Did he drink when you first knew him?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All the time. The bottles would accumulate in the studio. There was no stopping it. But I must say, very often it did not overtly affect his playing ability. It did affect his ability to communicate in rational, reasonable terms. But then he would just pick up the guitar and just blow you away. So somehow he built what alcohol did to him. It built into his metabolism in a way that came out very well. That's all I can say. Go figure.
One of our participants who couldn't be here tonight, Max Oakes, was once quoted as saying, he said he was really kind of a morbidly shy person in general, so he'd have to drink a lot of booze in order to get up and play. But then if he drank too much booze in between sets and after, he was difficult to deal with. So it was this dual-edged sword with him. You know, he needed the alcohol, but it could also cause problems. Questions? Other questions? Yes, here.
Wonder if he was married or had siblings or children, or what his life was like growing up.
Yeah, so he was married, and Gene can comment on this too. Jan Fahey was his first wife. They were married for a few years. The one in the middle, and then Melody Fahey. Sorry, I can't remember the one in the middle. So yeah, I think his relationships, just from what I've read, again, didn't know him, were pretty complex. I think he had some demons, as David said earlier, and he could be a difficult person to deal with. When Gene's film comes out, you'll see, yeah, he could also be a total smart ass, and he had a sharp sense of humor, but he could also be kind of cruel. So we're not trying to, we don't see him as a god, but we know he's a man, and he was troubled, and yeah, he had some difficult relationships. So to answer your question, he's married 3 times, no children. No brothers and sisters, only child. His parents divorced when he was in 5th or 6th grade. New York Avenues, where he lived with Al and Jane, actually first lived over at 4th and Butternut, which is where the grandparents lived. And that's the first couple years before they bought a house on New York Avenue. Lived there for many years until, I think, around 6th or 7th grade. There was some potential abuse from his father, so the mother, Jane, took him and they moved over to New Hampshire Avenue, 7101, which is where the original first Takoma record, Blind Joe Death, John Fahey record, has that address, 7101 New Hampshire, which is why he went to school at Northwestern. He didn't go to Blair. He got sent that way. He was on the other side of the road.
A couple of years ago, we had, was it Glenn Jones,
yes.
Mark? Mm-hmm. We had him in concert at David Potts Dupree's house. And there was a time for, I guess, a little bit of talking afterwards. And we'd heard that John's first girlfriend was attending the event. And in fact, that was true. Somebody, wasn't me, and I amazed they asked this. They came up to her and said, so, did you ever sleep with John? And she said, no. And the woman asked, I think it was a woman asking this other woman, how come? And the woman said, I was only 14 at the time. So,
true story.
True story. I was there. Yeah.
Other questions for our fine panel here? Yes, sir. Here.
It's just the inevitable question of whether the demise of Takoma Records had anything to do with his alcoholism or no.
No, he was way ahead alcohol-wise.
And actually, John was, and Tom kind of alluded to this, John was way out of the process. I mean, him and Ed Denson started it, and then other folks like Charlie Mitchell and John Monday, other people had to, he was not a businessman. No. He started it, and then other people took care of it. Yeah.
Concord.
Richard.
I just want to point out, I think for historical purposes, because this is always fun, if you happen to park in the parking lot behind the library, if you pick up a stone and you throw it over that fence, you will hit Takoma Park Middle School, which is, of course, where he went. So, people like to make that personal connection, and I thought I'd provide this opportunity, pointing out that one of the places that he spent many years is literally 200 feet away.
And the house, the New York Avenue house, is still there. I actually was, about 10 years ago, I went and interviewed the people who live there, and they took me inside and showed me the house, which was really cool, and told me some stories. Then I went back like 2 years ago, and the neighbor at the house next door in the corner, there's a little small house, said, oh, this is very famous. I said, well, it's not that famous. I mean, yeah, it's famous. It's John Fahey. No, this is where Matt Drudge lived from the Drudge Report in Takoma Park. So I'm kind of shocked that he didn't get run out of town on a rail. And I'm like, Matt Drudge lived in Takoma Park. Okay. Next door to John Fahey's boyhood home. So. Wow. Any other questions? Yes. Sarah Bachman.
This is actually kind of more of a comment, but speaking of familial or those connections, there's obviously few places that can boast such a connection with John Fahey than Takoma Park. And there's a great guy named Marcus Obst of Dying for Bad Music who is creating this map of the United States that has all of the primitivists and their references like tagged like different locations. So if you ever think to and you hear, have you seen the map? It's really neat, and it's all of the contemporary American primitivists. Daniel's on it, and it's kind of cool. And sometimes, like when I'm driving around Virginia, one moment when I saw like Smoky Ordinary, like Lane, which was a Fahey title, and I was like, oh, he must have been here. He must have seen Smoky Ordinary. Those sort of moments, if you ever have them, I can give you the information afterwards if you're interested in viewing this map. And I guess a question that I might have is when I think of primitivists, contemporary or after people that Fahey influenced, I guess my favorites are always those who somehow they make it their own in some way. The best example that I can think of, one of my favorites would be Basho. But are there contemporary primitivists that any of you can think of that stand out, excepting Daniel because he's here and I don't want to embarrass him, but or that extending far like other other forms of contemporary folk music, people who synthesize a lot of different traditions to come up with one really beautiful product. Does that make sense? I don't know. But can you think of anybody, like one person that comes to my mind, like Jake Fussell or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, that's all.
Daniel. I think Jack Rose, if no one's familiar with his stuff, he grew up pretty close to here too. He died of a heart attack a couple years ago when he was 38 years old. It was really tragic, but he has about 10 records out, and his stuff is remarkable and deeply complex and sad and emotional and joyful and all the above. And he's still around.
Glenn Jones is one of my favorites. You mentioned him.
And just to follow up to that, Sarah's question, there's going to be Glenn Jones and Daniel Bachman and Nathan Bowles and a lot of these players, Sarah Louise, a lot of these players that we're calling American Primitive, they're going to be performing in and around Takoma April 13th, 14th, and 15th. It's called the 1,000 Incarnations of the Rose. It's being put on here through Rhizome. Historic Takoma is also a sponsor. WOWD, LP Radio here in Tacoma is a sponsor. So be on the lookout for that April 13th, 14th, 15th. Daniel will be back with 24 other guitarists over the course of 3 days. So, so definitely check that out, and that's through Rhizome. Question back here.
Thank you, and thank you all for putting this on. I've really enjoyed this. I just want to know who has control of the masters now from Takoma Records.
Concord Music Group, as far as I know. We tried to release another Takoma record, a really obscure one called Home Gas, that were about 5 folklorists from Indiana, Bloomington, that were expats and moved to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and we had to put the brakes on it because we couldn't afford the licensing fees that Concord wanted. They wanted about $5,000 just for the licensing. So that was about 5 years ago. So I imagine that they still own it. But you can bootleg that stuff because I don't think that they really are watching it that close. So you don't tell anybody.
Hey, Daniel, real quick. Daniel just recently came across an archive of early music. Do you want to talk just briefly about your project and what you're working on? You don't have to get into too many details. I know it's early.
Yeah, it's a large archive of early American music, all from Virginia. That most of it predates John Lomax, and nothing's ever been released of it. So my sister and I are doing all that research right now together, and we're going to put it together for people to read about it and enjoy, and hopefully the next couple of years. But it's everything. It's statewide, and it's every type of music: black and white, secular, religious, and it's pretty cool. So we're working hard on that. I was at the Library of Congress all day, and giving them material that they lent us and stuff. And It's very exciting. So keep an eye out. We're working on that. It's cool.
Is it at all similar to the traditional music of Virginia series that came out?
It's completely unknown. It's been in the UVA Special Collections Library since 1936.
Wow.
And it's on about 200 12-inch aluminum discs that were recorded in the field from the Fredericksburg area all the way down to the Kentucky-Tennessee border and Eastern Virginia and South Side and everywhere. But it's just kind of like a snapshot of where musical expression was in the early 30s. And there about a third of the performers were born before the Civil War, which makes it really unique as well. So some of the music is, I mean, for lack of a better word, medieval sounding. It's pretty old.
Let's note that John Fahey would have loved to delve into that.
He probably would have.
Oh, God.
He probably would have.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
Not really a question, but a comment. I had a couple of bootleg 8-tracks of John Fahey in the early 70s. So bootlegs, he didn't make any money off of them. Maybe that would have pleased him, I don't know. But what I remember, that the two words that come to mind are hypnotic and spooky, because I had an old convertible to drive around late at night, and it just somehow fit. A late night with deserted streets and the clouds scudding across the moon, and it just puts you in a different place. And I mean, it's nothing else like it. I mean, you know, Leo Kottke's great and Basho's great, but there's something about Fahey's it's almost otherworldly, some of it.
Have any other questions? All right, I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank organizer David Eisner, Institute of Musical Traditions, journalist Richard Harrington for being here, radio journalist Tom Cole, NPR journalist, DC Public Library archivist, Special Collections Ray Barker, and of course, give it up for Daniel Johnston. Just kidding. All right, thank you for being here tonight, all right? And you can check out Daniel Bachman's music right out front. And anything else from the...
Daniel will be out there.